Long before medieval Europe formed its kingdoms, before Islam and Christianity reshaped the regions around the Red Sea, a powerful civilization began rising in the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. It emerged in a landscape carved by mountains, fertile valleys, and trade routes that connected Africa's interior with the world beyond the sea. Archaeological surveys, inscriptions in the ancient script of Ge'ez, and references in Roman and Persian records reveal that this land developed distinct cultural and political structures by the first millennium BCE, long before Axum became a recognizable empire. In the early centuries, small chiefdoms dominated the region, competing for control of gold, ivory, obsidian, and livestock. These communities developed complex terraced agriculture, stone masonry, and early religious traditions blending South Arabian influences with indigenous African beliefs. Linguistic evidence shows that the Semitic languages of the region evolved locally from ancient Afro-Asiatic roots, while inscriptions found at Yeha, one of the earliest monumental sites, show cultural exchange with the Sabaeans of South Arabia. At Yeha, archaeologists uncovered a massive stone temple dedicated to Almaka, built with precise ashlar masonry that still stands after nearly 3,000 years. That temple hints at the early sophistication of the region, long before Aksum rose to power. Trade shaped the destiny of these early societies. Caravans carrying ivory, incense, gold, and animal skins moved steadily toward the Red Sea coast. Ports like Adulis, mentioned by the Greek navigator in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, served as gateways between Africa and the Red Sea world. Ships from Egypt, Arabia, India, and the Roman Empire visited Adulis, bringing textiles, glass, iron, wine, and tools. This constant movement of goods and ideas laid the economic foundation on which the future Aksumite kingdom would rise. By the 1st century CE, inscriptions begin mentioning a new political authority, a kingdom capable of uniting multiple regions under one ruler. This emerging state controlled the highlands, the coastal trade routes, and the vast caravan networks linking the African interior with the sea. Archaeological layers from this period show increasingly complex settlements, fortified centers, and the appearance of stelae, stone monuments that would later define Aksumite architecture. Greek and Roman writers describe this rising power as a formidable regional force. Pliny the Elder mentions the city of Axum in his Natural History, indicating that Mediterranean observers were aware of the kingdom's presence. Around the same time, the Periplus notes the strength of the Aksumite king and his influence over trade from the Nile region to the Arabian Peninsula. These accounts provide the earliest external confirmation of Aksum's growing might. Religious traditions also evolved during this formative period. The people practiced a blend of indigenous highland beliefs, ancestor veneration, and deities influenced by South Arabian pantheons. Archaeological finds suggest rituals involving incense burners, figurines, and sacred enclosures built near springs and mountain peaks. These early spiritual systems would later merge into a uniquely Aksumite religious identity that prepared the kingdom for dramatic transformations to come. As political authority expanded, so did Aksum's technological achievements. Engineers developed advanced stone-cutting techniques, producing perfectly fitted blocks without mortar. Terraced farms and irrigation structures supported dense populations in the highlands. Metalworkers crafted iron tools and weapons, while artisans created intricate pottery and jewelry that show both African and Arabian artistic influences. Each of these elements contributed to the formation of a kingdom capable of competing with the greatest powers of its age. By the 2nd century CE, Axum was no longer a loose collection of highland chiefdoms. It had transformed into a centralized monarchy with increasing control over trade, territory, and cultural life. Its kings began issuing inscriptions in Ge'ez and constructing monumental architecture that signaled not just wealth, but ambition. The stage was set for Axum to rise as one of the world's great empires, controlling commerce, shaping regional politics, and developing a cultural identity that would endure for more than a millennium. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Axum's growth accelerated into a true imperial transformation. Archaeological excavations from the capital reveal increasingly complex urban planning, wide avenues paved with stone, drainage systems carved into bedrock, multi-story palatial structures, and elite residential compounds that showcased the kingdom's wealth. At this stage, inscriptions begin referring to rulers as kings of Aksum and Himyar, signaling ambitions that extended beyond the African highlands and across the Red Sea. The port city of Adulis became central to Aksum's rise. The author of The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea describes Adulis as a bustling international trade hub where merchants from Rome, Egypt, Arabia, Persia, and India exchanged goods. Ivory from African elephants, rhino horns, frankincense, gold, tortoise shell, obsidian, and animal skins were among the exports that made Axum wealthy. In return, Axum imported fine cloth, crafted glass, wine, metal tools, jewelry, and luxury goods. The taxes collected from this trade flowed directly to the Axumite kings, funding armies, construction projects, and the monumental stelae fields that later generations associated with Axum's imperial grandeur. Axumite kings understood the importance of projecting power, both internally and externally. They minted their own coins, at first in bronze, then silver, and eventually gold, making Axum the first sub-Saharan African kingdom to create a standardized currency. Numismatic studies of these coins reveal the portraiture of kings wearing crowns decorated with stalks of grain, symbols of fertility and sovereignty. The inscriptions appear in Greek at first, reflecting Axum's connection to Mediterranean trade networks, but later coins introduced Ge'ez scripts, signaling the rise of a confident African identity. In addition to commerce, Axum expanded militarily. Classical sources, such as the writings of Cosmas Indicopleustes, describe Axumite armies equipped with iron weapons and skilled in large-scale campaigns. These forces secured caravan routes, seized control of neighboring polities, and protected Axumite influence across the Red Sea. The kingdom's wealth allowed it to field armies capable of long-distance expeditions, ensuring that rivals in both Africa and Arabia recognized its growing dominance. Religious evolution also played a defining role in Axum's early imperial phase. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence points to the worship of multiple deities, including Maram, a war god, and Beher, a sea god. Temples built in earlier centuries were expanded or reconstructed using Axumite architectural styles. Features such as recessed windows, layered stone construction, and carved wooden beams embedded in masonry. Ritual offerings of incense, livestock, and grain continued to be practiced, reflecting continuity with older African traditions, even as the kingdom absorbed influences from Arabia and the Mediterranean world. By the 3rd century, Axum was firmly established as a major regional power. Greek writers like the scholar Ptolemy included Axum on their world maps, listing it among the most important cities south of Egypt. The Monumentum Adulitanum, an inscription attributed to an Axumite king known as Sembrauthes, details military victories across the Nile Valley and Arabian Peninsula. Although only fragments of the inscription survive, preserved by the later writer Cosmas, it provides invaluable testimony to Axum's early expansion. The kingdom's political structure began to stabilize into a powerful monarchy supported by noble families, priestly elites, and regional governors. Tribute flowed into the capital from conquered territories and allied chiefdoms. The king's authority was reinforced by religious rituals, coinage, and monumental construction, especially the towering stone stelae that signaled not just burial traditions, but the authority of the ruling dynasty. These structures, some reaching over 20 meters in height, remain among the most impressive monolithic monuments in the ancient world. As the 3rd century transitioned into the 4th, Axum stood on the brink of becoming one of the great empires of antiquity. Its rulers controlled trade from Sudan to Yemen, commanded the loyalty of diverse African peoples, and maintained relationships with Rome, Persia, and India. Its influence stretched across seas and deserts, mountains, and plains. What began as a group of highland chiefdoms had transformed into an African superpower, whose next era would define its place in global history. By the beginning of the 4th century CE, Axum had become one of the most formidable powers of the ancient world. Classical writers compared it to Persia, Rome, and China, civilizations whose names dominated global commerce and diplomacy. In this period, Axum's rulers expanded their authority across multiple frontiers, transforming the kingdom into a multi-ethnic empire connected through trade, conquest, and political alliances. The strategic importance of Axum's geography cannot be overstated. Situated between the fertile highlands and the Red Sea basin, Aksum controlled both inland caravans and maritime shipping lanes. Goods from Africa's interior, gold from the Nile region, emeralds from the eastern deserts, ivory from elephant-rich plains, incense from southern Arabia, animal skins and spices flowed through Aksumite hands. Adulis, the empire's principal port, became one of the most active commercial centers described in the ancient world. Ships from India and Ceylon anchored beside Roman and Persian vessels, creating a cosmopolitan marketplace where languages, currencies, and cultures intertwined. This economic power strengthened Aksum's political authority. Inscriptions from this era, such as the trilingual records of King Ezana, show a highly organized administration capable of recording victories, imposing tribute, and maintaining control over distant territories. Ezana's inscriptions, written in Ge'ez, Sabaic, and Greek, reflect an empire confident in its identity, yet deeply connected to the international world. They describe campaigns against the Blemis in the Nile Valley and victories over rebellious groups within Aksum's sphere of influence. These inscriptions are among the earliest African records of statecraft written in a native script. The 4th century also marked one of the most transformative events in Aksumite history, the adoption of Christianity. Contemporary writings and later Ethiopian chronicles attribute this change to the influence of Frumentius, a Syrian Christian who, according to tradition, gained favor in the Aksumite royal court and eventually became the kingdom's first bishop. Byzantine sources mention the spread of Christianity in the region, noting that Axum maintained direct contact with the Roman Empire. The conversion of King Ezana made Axum one of the first major states in the world to officially adopt Christianity, predating many European kingdoms. This religious shift reshaped Aksumite culture, politics, and art. Crosses began appearing on coinage, replacing earlier symbols associated with pre-Christian traditions. Churches were constructed with the characteristic Aksumite stone architecture, timber-framed walls, recessed windows, and monumental stairways. Christianity provided ideological cohesion for the expanding empire and strengthened diplomatic ties with Byzantium, a powerful ally in the region's shifting geopolitical landscape. While religion transformed internal identity, Axum's external ambitions intensified. By the mid-4th century, military expeditions reached deep into Nubia, where Aksumite forces pushed northward along the Nile, asserting influence over territories fragmented by internal disputes. Archaeological remains and inscriptions reference Aksum's presence in these regions, demonstrating the empire's capacity to project power far beyond its highland core. Axum's authority also extended across the Red Sea. The Arabian Peninsula was a mosaic of kingdoms competing for control of incense routes, oases, and tribal alliances. Aksumite rulers, supported by their naval capabilities and wealth, frequently intervened in the politics of southern Arabia. Coin hoards and inscriptions found in Yemen reflect Aksum's long-standing presence and influence in the region, laying the groundwork for even greater expansions in the centuries to come. This era also saw the apex of Aksum's monumental architecture. The towering stelae fields continued to grow, marking royal burials and elite tombs. These monoliths, carved from single pieces of granite, quarried miles from Axum, showcased engineering feats unmatched in much of the ancient world. Some stelae weighed hundreds of tons and required immense labor, organization, and technological skill. Their non-religious symbolism remains debated, but most scholars link them to authority, lineage, and the continuity of royal power. By the end of the 4th century, Axum had achieved a level of political and economic integration rare in antiquity. Its rulers controlled key trade corridors, maintained diplomatic ties with global powers, and oversaw a population diverse in languages, cultures, and traditions. Christianity, monumental art, and a booming economy fueled confidence in the empire's future. Axum was poised not just to influence its region, but to reshape the political landscape of an entire hemisphere. As the 4th century progressed, the reign of King Ezana marked a defining turning point, an era in which Axum emerged fully as a world power, recognized across continents for its military strength, cultural sophistication, and expanding spiritual identity. Ezana's rule is unusually well documented for an African king of antiquity. Inscriptions carved in stone, coinage bearing his image, and accounts by foreign writers allow us to reconstruct his reign with clarity unmatched by many contemporary civilizations. Ezana's inscriptions reveal a ruler who understood both the symbolism of kingship and the value of written legitimacy. His trilingual stelae, written in Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaic, proclaimed his victories, announced territorial control, and served as diplomatic communications to a diverse empire. The Greek elements underscored Aksum's participation in the international world of the Mediterranean, while the Sabaic inscriptions reflected long-standing ties with South Arabia. The use of Ge'ez stamped Aksum's own cultural identity firmly into the record of antiquity. His military campaigns reshaped the region. Ezana's armies advanced northward into Nubia, confronting the Kushite kingdom at a time when internal fragmentation left it vulnerable. The inscriptions detail his conquests, victories over rebellious groups, and the imposition of tribute across the Nile frontier. These campaigns were not random incursions. They were strategic moves to secure trade routes, assert dominance over buffer states, and prevent rivals from threatening Aksum's control of the Red Sea corridor. Ezana's rule also witnessed a fundamental economic transformation. As Mediterranean trade shifted due to political tensions between Rome and Persia, Axum became an essential intermediary state. Goods that once flowed directly between the empires increasingly passed through Aksumite markets. Ports along the Red Sea grew busier, caravans expanded, and the royal treasury swelled with customs and taxes. Aksumite, gold coins from Ezana's reign, many preserved in European and African museums, reveal consistent weight standards and refined artistry. They offer evidence of a stable, state-controlled economy able to operate across vast distances. But Ezana's most enduring legacy was the formal adoption of Christianity. While earlier Aksumite religion had blended indigenous African beliefs with South Arabian influences, Christianity offered a unifying ideological framework compatible with the empire's expanding structures. Frumentius, known in Ethiopian tradition as Abba Salama, played a central role in this transition. Elevated to bishop by the Patriarch of Alexandria, he ensured Axum was integrated into the broader Christian world centered in the eastern Mediterranean. This alignment with Christianity strengthened ties with Byzantine emperors, who saw Axum as a friendly power capable of balancing Persian influence in the region. Church architecture began to rise across the highlands, often blending traditional Aksumite construction methods, monolithic blocks, recessed windows, and timber framing with new religious symbolism. The shift from pagan to Christian iconography on coinage visually marks the transformation of state identity during Ezana's rule. Internally, the spread of Christianity encouraged new forms of literacy, record-keeping, and artistic expression. Stone crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and carved wooden panels became part of Aksumite material culture. The earliest known Ethiopian Christian texts, though later copies, trace their origins to this period, reflecting the integration of scripture, local tradition, and imperial authority. Beyond religion and warfare, Ezana's era saw the expansion of Aksumite influence in South Arabia. While the full conquest of Himyar occurred later, Axum's presence in the region during Ezana's reign was already significant. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and coin hoards, demonstrates Axum's active role in Arabian trade and politics, setting the stage for even more ambitious campaigns centuries later. By the end of Ezana's reign, Axum had solidified its identity as a Christian African empire with international prestige and strategic influence. It commanded respect from Rome, maintained prestige among Arabian states, controlled essential trade routes, and presided over a flourishing highland civilization. The empire that emerged under Ezana was not merely a confederation of regions, it was a unified, confident state whose cultural and political foundations would shape Northeast Africa for the next millennium. After the transformative reign of Ezana, Axum entered a period of consolidation and refinement in which its infrastructure, architecture, economy, and cultural systems matured into some of the most sophisticated anywhere in the ancient world. The surviving archaeological remains from this era, monolithic stelae, subterranean tombs, masonry foundations, and intricate artifacts, offer a vivid testimony to what Aksum became, a civilization capable of producing both engineering marvels and a refined, interconnected economic order. The monumental stelae fields represent one of the clearest expressions of Aksumite ambition. Rising in rows across the imperial landscape, these stone towers were carved from single blocks of granite, quarried miles away from the capital. Transporting them required immense manpower, meticulously coordinated labor forces, and architectural planning that pushed the limits of ancient engineering. Each stela was shaped to resemble a multi-story palace facade, complete with carved windows, doors, and decorative features. These were not tombs in the Egyptian sense. They were symbols, expressions of lineage, status, and continuity of authority. Beneath many of these monoliths lay elaborate chamber tombs containing grave goods that reveal an elite society connected to global trade. The construction of these stelae demonstrates a deep understanding of stoneworking and structural balance. Archaeologists, studying the unfinished obelisks still lying in the quarries of Gobo Raya, have identified the techniques used to detach massive stones from the bedrock, techniques involving fire setting, chiseling, and the use of wooden wedges that expanded with moisture. Such precision attests to a specialized workforce and a tradition of architectural mastery that developed independently within the region. Urban life in Aksum was equally advanced. Excavations of residential compounds show multi-room stone houses with elevated platforms, interior courtyards, and sophisticated drainage systems. Artifacts recovered, ceramics, coins, beads, tools, and imported glassware, indicate that citizens had access to goods from distant markets. Evidence of iron smelting, weaving, pottery workshops, and agricultural terracing reflects a diversified economy able to support both urban elites and rural communities. Agriculture, the backbone of Aksum's wealth, benefited from highland geography and careful land management. Terraced hillsides, irrigation channels, and systems of seasonal cultivation allowed farmers to grow barley, wheat, teff, and various fruits. Livestock raising, especially cattle and sheep, was widespread. The stability of food production enabled Axum to support large populations, maintain armies, and sustain its elite architectural projects. Environmental studies of pollen samples and soil layers confirm the longevity of these agricultural systems. Trade continued to fuel imperial prosperity. Caravans moved inland products toward Adulis, where goods from across the Indian Ocean basin arrived. Roman glass, Persian textiles, Indian spices, and Arabian incense all passed through Aksumite markets. Inscriptions by foreign travelers emphasized the prosperity of Aksum-IS merchants and the smooth operation of its commercial networks. The kingdom's control over the Red Sea made it indispensable to Mediterranean powers navigating political tensions and shifting alliances. The coinage system expanded in this period, and coins minted by Aksumite kings circulated widely. These coins functioned not only as currency, but also as political statements. Their inscriptions and imagery provided a record of royal succession and ideological shifts, while their distribution across East Africa, Yemen, and Indian Ocean ports illustrates the kingdom's far-reaching economic influence. Numismatists often point to the purity of Aksumite gold coins as evidence of a stable and prosperous state capable of maintaining exacting monetary standards. Religion, too, became more deeply embedded in daily life. As Christianity spread beyond the court into the broader population, churches emerged in rural and urban settings alike. Stone foundations of early basilicas, complete with apses and altars aligned to liturgical requirements, show a fusion of Aksumite engineering and Christian symbolism. Murals, crosses, and carvings from this period highlight an artistic tradition that blended local styles with influences from Egypt, Nubia, and the Near East. Internally, Aksum developed an administrative hierarchy capable of managing tribute, taxation, infrastructure, and military obligations across its territories. Inscriptions referencing governors, tribute collectors, and officials reveal a system that balanced local autonomy with centralized oversight. This political organization allowed Axum to maintain cohesion even as it expanded its influence across difficult terrain and diverse populations. By the end of this era, Axum was more than an African kin. As Axum refined its internal structures and economic power, the kingdom began to turn its attention increasingly toward the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a sudden expansion, but the culmination of centuries of interaction with South Arabia. Through trade, diplomacy, migration, and shared cultural traits visible in language, architecture, and religious inscriptions. By the 5th century CE, Aksum was no longer simply participating in Indian Ocean commerce. It was influencing the political balance of the entire region. South Arabia, particularly the kingdoms of Himyar and Saba, was a wealthy and strategically valuable region. It controlled incense-producing areas, crucial caravan routes, and ports that connected the Near East to East Africa and India. The Aksumites, with their naval capabilities and accumulated wealth from Red Sea trade, were well positioned to intervene in Arabian affairs when opportunities arose. Archaeological discoveries in Yemen, including inscriptions referencing Aksumite rulers, confirm their presence and influence in the region long before full-scale intervention occurred. Diplomatic exchanges appear in inscriptions left by Aksumite and Himyarite rulers. These texts hint at alliances, rivalries, and occasional military actions across the strait. Aksumite interests in Arabia grew particularly strong when instability weakened local kingdoms. In this context, religious identities also began to play a role. As Christianity solidified within Axum and Judaism grew influential in parts of Himyar, ideological divisions occasionally overlapped with political ambitions. This complex interplay of power and belief set the stage for Axum's most dramatic overseas venture. By the 6th century CE, Axum reached the height of its international influence. The Byzantine Empire, embroiled in competition with Persia, recognized Axum as a crucial partner in controlling trade routes and countering Persian-supported factions in Arabia. Byzantine writings, including those of Procopius, describe diplomatic missions between Constantinople and Axum, underscoring the kingdom's recognized status among the great powers of the age. These alliances were not symbolic, they had strategic value. The Byzantines relied on Axum's ability to project naval force into the Red Sea, while Axum benefited from diplomatic recognition and access to Mediterranean markets. Axum's decisive overseas intervention came under King Caleb, Ella Asbeha, whose reign is remembered as one of the most assertive periods in the kingdom's history. Himyar, under its ruler Yusuf Asar Yathar, often identified as Du Nuwas, had entered a period of religious and political turmoil. Accounts from Syriac and Greek sources describe persecutions of Christian communities in Arabia. Caleb, encouraged by the Byzantine emperor and motivated by both religious solidarity and political interest, launched a large-scale military campaign across the Red Sea. This expedition, documented by Procopius and corroborated by inscriptions found in Ethiopia and Yemen, succeeded in overthrowing the Himyarite king. Axum installed a vassal ruler, thereby extending its authority over significant parts of southern Arabia. The scale of the operation demonstrates Axum's military capacity. Transporting troops, equipment, and supplies across the sea required coordination comparable to the major naval powers of antiquity. For a time, Axum became the dominant force in southern Arabia. Its presence reshaped regional politics, secured Christian communities, and ensured Axumite control over critical trade nodes. Evidence of this influence appears in inscriptions bearing the names of Aksumite-appointed kings, coinage reflecting their authority, and architectural remains showing African influence in Arabian settlements. The kingdom's overseas empire was not vast in geographic terms, but it was profoundly strategic, anchoring Axum's position in the global economy. However, maintaining influence in Arabia proved challenging. Local resistance, shifting alliances, and the constant pressure from the Persian Sasanian Empire weakened Aksumite authority over time. Though Caleb's successors managed to retain influence for several decades, the overseas foothold gradually eroded as new forces emerged in the region. Still, Aksum's intervention remains one of the most remarkable examples of African geopolitical power in late antiquity, a decisive moment in which the kingdom played a central role in shaping the political landscape of the Arabian Peninsula. Despite the challenges, Aksum's projection of military, religious, and economic influence across the Red Sea demonstrated the kingdom's extraordinary reach. The empire's peak was defined not only by its monumental architecture and internal organization, but also by its ability to operate across continents in a world where most states remained confined to local affairs. The 6th century stands as a testament to Aksum's. At the height of its power, Axum developed a cultural identity expressed through monumental architecture, artistic refinement, and a written tradition that set it apart from its regional contemporaries. These achievements were not merely decorative. They reflected a complex social structure, a confident ruling class, and a civilization whose wealth and stability enabled it to invest in permanent expressions of identity and authority. The imperial capital of Aksum was a city of imposing visual statements. Towering stelae rose above elite compounds and public plazas, their carved facades echoing the architectural vocabulary of Aksumite palaces. These monoliths, some over 20 meters tall, were carefully placed in ceremonial fields that served as both sacred and political spaces. The engineering skill required to quarry, transport, and raise these enormous structures demonstrates logistical sophistication rarely matched in the ancient world. Experimental archaeology has shown that moving stones of this scale would require hundreds of coordinated laborers using sledges, rollers, and pulley systems, technology well within Axum's capabilities. Below the stelae lay multi-chambered tombs constructed from finely cut granite blocks. These subterranean complexes often contained grave goods, such as bronze vessels, glassware, iron tools, beads, and imported luxury items. The presence of Roman glass and Indian beads in Aksumite burials confirms the reach of the kingdom's trade networks. These tombs also reveal the hierarchical nature of Aksumite society, with elite families receiving monumental burial structures reflecting their status. Aksumite palatial architecture displayed distinctive features: massive stone basements, wooden beams embedded in walls to absorb seismic stress, and decorative stonework carved into geometric patterns. The foundations of these structures suggest multi-story buildings supported by timber frames, an architectural style suited to the kingdom's highland environment. Elite residences often included large reception halls, elevated platforms, and courtyards that served both administrative and ceremonial functions. The shift to Christianity added new architectural forms to the landscape. Churches constructed during and after Ezana's reign often adapted basilica designs from the Roman world but executed them with Aksum's traditional building techniques. Archaeologists have uncovered early Christian basilicas with stone columns, apse formations, and liturgical furnishings, many of which preserve traces of murals and inscriptions. The integration of Christian symbols with indigenous artistic motifs produced a visual language unique to the Ethiopian highlands, a synthesis that continued to evolve long after Aksum's political decline. Artistic expression flourished alongside architecture. Aksumite metalworkers produced intricate jewelry, crowns, and personal ornaments using gold, silver, and bronze. The craftsmanship visible in surviving pieces, some decorated with filigree, granulation, and embossed designs, suggests workshops employing advanced metallurgical techniques. Pottery, though less visually dramatic, evolved into standardized forms that served domestic, ceremonial, and trade purposes. Certain styles of red-slipped ware found across the Horn of Africa reflect Aksumite influence that extended beyond its political borders. Writing and literacy also played an essential role in Aksumite culture. The Ge'ez script, derived from earlier South Arabian alphabets, became the official script of the kingdom, evolving into a distinctive abugida suited to local languages. Inscriptions carved on stelae, tablets, and architectural elements document royal decrees, religious dedications, and commemorations of military victories. These inscriptions provide some of the earliest African written records that combine local languages with international scripts like Greek. The spread of Christianity encouraged the creation of manuscripts that blended scriptural content with local artistic traditions. Though most surviving Ethiopian manuscripts date from later centuries, the roots of this illuminated tradition clearly trace back to Aksumite scribal culture. Early liturgical texts, hymns, and ecclesiastical writings laid the intellectual foundation for what would become one of the world's longest continuous Christian literary traditions. Trade routes continued to reinforce Aksum's cultural richness. Imported goods such as Mediterranean wine, Indian textiles, Arabian incense, and Chinese silk were not only consumed by elites, but also became symbols of status and cosmopolitan identity. In return, Aksumite goods, especially ivory, gold, iron, and agricultural products, circulated widely across the Red Sea world. This constant exchange introduced new styles, technologies, and ideas into Aksum's cultural landscape. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, Aksum had become a center of artistic, architectural, and light. The kingdom of Aksum prepared to take the most dramatic political and military step in its history, one that would extend its reach far beyond Africa, reshape the politics of the Arabian Peninsula, and draw the attention of the world's superpowers. The Himyarite kingdom of southern Arabia, long connected to Aksum through trade and cultural exchange, had fallen into internal conflict and ideological divisions. Jewish, Christian, and polytheistic communities coexisted uneasily, and the rise of a powerful Himyarite ruler, Yusuf As'ar Yathar, known in many sources as Du Nuwas, sparked regional upheaval. Syriac chronicles, such as the Book of the Himyarites, and Greek accounts by writers like Procopius describe religious persecutions carried out by the Himyarite court, particularly against Christian communities aligned with the Byzantine world. These events alarmed both the Byzantine Empire and Aksum. Byzantium, locked in a bitter rivalry with the Persian Sasanian Empire, saw an opportunity to strengthen its influence in Arabia by supporting Christian allies. Axum, sharing religious ties with Byzantium and economic interests in Arabian trade routes, found its strategic objectives aligned with those of the Eastern Roman court. Aksum's ruler at the time, King Caleb, Ella Asbeha, emerged as a decisive figure. Inscriptions and later Ethiopian chronicles portray him as a warrior king driven by both political calculation and religious conviction. Encouraged by diplomatic exchanges with Byzantium, Caleb launched a full-scale military invasion of Himyar, a bold enterprise unprecedented in African antiquity. The logistics were immense. Aksumite forces crossed the Red Sea with ships large enough to carry cavalry, infantry, supplies, and equipment. The scale of the operation astonished contemporary writers. Procopius, observing from the Byzantine side, remarked on Aksum's ability to project power across the sea with the confidence of a Mediterranean empire. Archaeological evidence from Yemen, including inscriptions and traces of Aksumite material culture, supports accounts of a significant military presence. The campaign succeeded. Aksumite armies defeated the Himyarite forces, dethroned Du Nuwas, and installed a Christian ruler, Samyafa Ashwa, loyal to Aksum. For the first time, an African empire controlled not only the Red Sea but also major territories on the Arabian Peninsula. With control over Himyar, Aksum dominated key caravan routes, incense trade, and ports that connected Arabia to Persia and India. However, the occupation of Himyar proved far more complex than the conquest. Local resistance and geopolitical interference soon challenged Aksumite authority. The Sasanian Empire, seeking to limit Byzantine and Aksumite influence, supported Arab factions opposed to Aksum's rule. Insurrection broke out, and Aksumite-appointed rulers faced increasing pressure from rival groups. Caleb sent a second force under a general named Abraha, whose name appears in inscriptions across Yemen. Abraha established himself as a powerful figure, ruling much of Himyar with relative autonomy while still acknowledging nominal loyalty to Aksum. His reign is remembered in South Arabian inscriptions that detail architectural projects, military campaigns, and diplomatic exchanges. Abraha restored stability in parts of the region, rebuilt irrigation systems like the Great Dam of Marib, and commissioned monumental inscriptions celebrating his victories. During this period, Axum stood at the center of a triangular power struggle involving Byzantium, Persia, and Arabian kingdoms. The Red Sea became a contested frontier of global politics, with Axum balancing alliances, trade relationships, and military commitments. Although Axum's occupation of Himyar was challenged repeatedly, its impact reshaped the political landscape of Arabia in the decades leading to the rise of Islam. The extended Axumite presence in Arabia demonstrated the kingdom's exceptional military capacity and diplomatic reach. Few African states in ancient or medieval history engaged in overseas expansion on such a scale. Axum's ability to intervene decisively in foreign conflicts, sustain long-distance military operations, and negotiate with superpowers like Byzantium reflects a level of sophistication often overlooked in broader narratives of antiquity. Yet, even as Axum exerted influence abroad, internal challenges and environmental pressures at home began to emerge. The era of expansion across the Red Sea marked both the summit of Axum's power and the fragile threshold beyond which the empire would eventually begin to decline. As Axum projected its power across the Red Sea and expanded its influence into southern Arabia, the kingdom appeared at the height of its strength. Its architecture soared. Its armies reached foreign shores, and its merchants navigated global trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to India. Yet beneath this surface of wealth and stability, the foundations of the empire were beginning to experience pressures. Pressures not created by political rivals alone, but by long-term environmental changes and global economic shifts far beyond Axum's control. Climatological studies based on pollen cores, soil analysis, and regional hydrological research revealed that the Horn of Africa experienced gradual but significant environmental transformations between the 6th and 7th centuries. Rainfall patterns, once reliable enough to sustain terraced agriculture and livestock herding, began to decline. Highland soils, thin and vulnerable to erosion when not carefully maintained, show evidence of water loss and agricultural stress. The drying of springs, riverbeds, and seasonal streams affected both rural communities and urban centers reliant on stable agricultural output. This decline in rainfall had cascading consequences. Terraces that once supported grain fields required greater maintenance, placing pressure on animal husbandry. The rural population, forming the backbone of Axum's economy, found itself increasingly vulnerable to drought cycles. Although the highlands were more resilient than the lowlands, prolonged ecological stress undermined surplus production, the very surplus that had supported the royal court, monumental projects, military campaigns, and international trade. At the same time, global trade patterns began to shift. The rise of the Sasanian Empire in Persia, followed by intensified competition with Byzantium, altered long-established commercial routes. Conflicts disrupted maritime commerce in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, reducing traffic to ports like Adulis. Meanwhile, new overland routes in Arabia redirected goods away from coastal cities controlled or influenced by Axum. In the early 7th century, the emergence of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula dramatically reshaped political and economic dynamics. As Islamic polities unified the Arabian tribes and consolidated control over trade corridors, the Red Sea became increasingly dominated by Muslim merchants and naval forces. Aksum, once the gateway between Africa and Asia, now found itself competing in a transformed commercial world where the centers of influence shifted northward and eastward. The weakening of Aksum's overseas footholds further reduced its access to trade revenues. Abraha's successors in Yemen eventually lost their autonomy as Persian-supported factions gained control of the region. With the fall of Axumite authority in Himyar, the empire not only lost political leverage but also forfeited key sources of income and strategic advantage. The Red Sea, once a highway of Axumite commerce, slowly became a corridor dominated by rival powers. Internally, the administrative structure of the empire faced strain. Maintaining the complex hierarchy of governors, tribute collectors, military garrisons, and religious officials depended on stable resource flows. As agricultural output fell and trade revenues diminished, the ability of the royal court to sustain the machinery of empire declined. Elite families, once firmly tied to the monarchy, may have begun asserting greater regional autonomy in response to shifting power balances. Environmental pressures also affected population distribution. Archaeological surveys show evidence that certain highland settlements were gradually abandoned between the 7th and 9th centuries. Soil depletion, resource scarcity, and changing rainfall patterns contributed to migration toward more fertile or sheltered areas. This movement reduced the labor force available for supporting urban centers, agricultural projects, and monumental architecture. Religious and cultural continuity, however, remained strong. Christianity, deeply rooted in Aksum's identity, continued to flourish even as political structures weakened. Churches remained active, liturgical traditions continued to develop, and the Ge'ez language remained central to cultural life. The religious cohesion of the kingdom proved far more durable than its political or economic systems. By the close of the 6th century and into the early 7th, Aksum stood at a crossroads. It remained a respected civilization with deep cultural foundations, a Christian kingdom maintaining ties with the broader world, and an empire whose past achievements still commanded global recognition. But the gradual convergence of environmental decline, shifting trade networks, geopolitical transformations, and internal stresses signaled that Aksum's era of expansion was ending. A new and more challenging phase as the 7th century progressed, the kingdom of Aksum entered a period marked not by sudden collapse, but by a quiet, extended process of contraction. Historians and archaeologists agree that Aksum's decline unfolded slowly over generations as political stability weakened, economic capacity narrowed, and regional power centers shifted toward emerging states in the surrounding highlands. What makes this phase of Aksum's history especially compelling is that the transformation was subtle, almost invisible in contemporary written sources. Rather than dramatic invasions or internal revolutions, the empire gradually retracted inward, adjusting to changes that it could not fully control. The decline in external trade continued to erode Aksum's economic foundation. As Islamic polities consolidated control of coastal Arabia and the Red Sea, major maritime routes became increasingly aligned with new centers of political authority. Ports, once dominated by Aksumite merchants, now facilitated commerce for traders affiliated with emerging Islamic networks. The shift was not immediate or hostile. It reflected a natural realignment of commercial power. Yet the consequences for Aksum were profound. Without reliable access to the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean trading systems, the state lost vital revenue streams that had sustained both its urban elite and rural producers. Adulis, once the vibrant center of long-distance trade, appears to have been abandoned or significantly diminished during this period. Archaeological investigations reveal layers of sediment and signs of reduced habitation, possibly due to environmental change, economic stagnation, or political instability. The port's decline symbolized the broader challenges facing the empire. Even if the highland capital attempted to maintain its networks, the shrinking of its maritime gateway severed Axum from the international economic systems it had once dominated. Within the highlands, political authority became increasingly decentralized. The royal court retained symbolic significance but struggled to enforce direct control over distant regions. Tribute systems weakened, and local elites gained greater autonomy. This decentralization does not appear to have been violent. Rather, it was a gradual rebalancing of power, with provinces turning inward to manage their own affairs. Inscriptions and coinage from later centuries become scarce, another sign that the central authority's reach was diminishing. Coin production provides one of the clearest indicators of this transition. During Aksum's golden age, kings minted abundant gold and silver coins used in both domestic and international trade. But by the 7th century, high-value coinage declined sharply. Later issues appear in bronze, often crudely cast and limited in circulation. The economic contraction evident in this numismatic record reflects reduced access to gold, diminished trade, and weakening state capacity. As monetary production declined, so too did the mechanisms through which the state asserted its legitimacy. Religious life, however, remained strong. Christianity did not wither with the empire's political retreat. Instead, it evolved into a deeply rooted cultural system that shaped community life and sustained social cohesion. Churches continued to function, and monastic communities began to gain influence. These monastic centers played increasingly significant roles in preserving manuscript traditions, reinforcing moral authority, and providing spiritual leadership at times when the political structure grew uncertain. The endurance of religious institutions offered continuity even as political structures shifted. Environmental stresses persisted as well. The long-term reduction in rainfall, compounded by soil erosion and declining agricultural yields, may have prompted population movements from depleted areas to more fertile or defensible regions. Archaeological surveys of formerly thriving settlements reveal reduced occupation layers in the late Aksumite period. Some communities relocated to higher elevations with more reliable water sources, while others dispersed into smaller rural clusters better suited to subsistence-based lifestyles. Despite these challenges, Axum did not disappear abruptly. The royal lineage likely persisted, though its authority became more symbolic and localized. Small-scale governance structures evolved, retaining elements of Aksumite tradition but adapting to changing realities. Even as the empire lost its economic and political coherence, its cultural legacy remained influential. The architectural style of Axum continued to shape church construction. The Ge'ez script remained central to liturgy and religious scholarship. Oral traditions preserved memories of past kings and monumental deeds. This phase of slow contraction would eventually culminate in a strategic withdrawal of political authority from the ancient capital. As pressures mounted from environmental by the late 7th and 8th centuries, Axum reached a point where sustaining its traditional centers of power, particularly the capital and its surrounding regions, became increasingly difficult. Environmental degradation continued to reduce agricultural productivity. Trade collapses had weakened the economic engine that once supported monumental architecture, administrative structures, and long-distance diplomacy. Political decentralization produced regional leaders whose authority rested less on imperial appointment and more on local alliances, lineage networks, and control of fertile land. As conditions deteriorated, the Aksumite state initiated a strategic relocation of political authority into the more protected and agriculturally stable highland regions to the south and southeast. This relocation remains one of the most important yet least documented transitions in Ethiopian history. Archaeological surveys reveal the gradual abandonment of Aksum's monumental core, with fewer signs of elite habitation and diminishing evidence of large-scale construction. Yet the withdrawal was not chaotic. Instead, it suggests a deliberate shift toward areas with more reliable rainfall, stronger defensive geography, and existing highland communities capable of integrating imperial lineage. This movement brought the Aksumite ruling class into closer contact with the rising socio-political centers of Tigray and the northern Amhara highlands. These regions offered fertile soils, dense forest resources, and natural fortifications, making them well-suited for sustaining smaller yet stable polities. The transition also enabled the preservation of Aksumite identity in a context where military pressures, environmental instability, and shifting trade dynamics could be managed more effectively. The relocation had cultural and ideological consequences. As churches and monastic communities accompanied the royal lineage into the highlands, the Christian tradition that had flourished under Ezana and his successors became even more deeply rooted. Monasteries emerged as repositories of Aksumite culture, guardians of liturgical manuscripts, custodians of historical memory, and stabilizing institutions in a period without strong centralized leadership. These monastic networks preserved Ge'ez literature, biblical translations, hymnals, and theological works that would form the foundation of Ethiopia's medieval Christian identity. The transition also marked a shift in architectural style. The massive stone structures and monumental stelae, characteristic of classical Axum, were no longer feasible in an era of reduced resources and different social needs. In their place emerged more modest yet symbolically powerful church complexes, often built with wood and stone hybrid techniques suited to highland terrain. Many early Ethiopian churches continued to incorporate stylistic elements inherited from Axum: recessed windows, carved beams, stepped platforms, even as their scale diminished. Politically, the relocation fragmented direct imperial rule. Instead of a unified empire, the highlands became a mosaic of small principalities, each led by hereditary nobles who traced their legitimacy to Aksumite lineage. These local leaders managed agricultural resources, settled disputes, upheld Christian rituals, and maintained connections to monastic authorities, gradually developing a political culture in which spiritual legitimacy was inseparable from claims to leadership. Despite the political decentralization, the symbolic authority of the Aksumite crown persisted. The memory of ancient kings, preserved through oral tradition and ecclesiastical writings, endowed rulers with a sacred lineage connected to both biblical narratives and ancient imperial achievements. This blending of mythic genealogy and historical continuity created a powerful ideological framework that would later be formalized in medieval chronicles. Though the empire had lost its territorial cohesion, it retained its identity as a Christian polity with deep historical roots. The shifting geopolitical landscape reinforced Aksum's retreat. The expansion of early Islamic states across Arabia and the Horn of Africa altered the balance of power in the Red Sea. Coastal towns that once belonged to Aksum's economic sphere now connected culturally and commercially to Islamic networks. Rather than confronting these states, the highland Christian polity avoided direct conflict by withdrawing to interior regions where geographical barriers ensured greater autonomy. Through this period, Axum did not experience a dramatic collapse, but a careful recalibration. It abandoned vulnerable territories while preserving cultural continuity. It relinquished its role as a maritime empire while consolidating a highland Christian kingdom. Most importantly, it maintained the ideological foundations that would allow future dynasties to claim direct descent from the ancient kings of Axum, even centuries after. As the 8th and 9th centuries unfolded, the transformation of Axum from a continental empire into a highland Christian kingdom reached its final stages. This was not a disappearance, but rather a metamorphosis that allowed Axumite culture, religion, and identity to survive long after the old imperial structures had faded. The twilight of Axum, therefore, is less a story of collapse and more a story of endurance, of how a civilization adapted to profound environmental, economic, and geopolitical changes while preserving its essence. In the old capital, monumental structures fell into disuse. The great stelae fields, once symbols of royal lineage and cosmic authority, stood in silent testimony to a bygone era. Excavations show that elite residences were no longer maintained, and administrative buildings saw fewer renovations. Workshops that once produced pottery, glass, and metal goods declined in activity. Without the wealth generated by Red Sea trade, the city could no longer sustain the scale of craftsmanship and labor that had made it a center of ancient innovation. Yet the region did not empty itself entirely. Smaller communities persisted around the ruins, maintaining agricultural routines, tending livestock, and preserving local traditions. The old capital, while no longer an imperial seat, remained a sacred landscape. Its churches continued to function, and its religious importance endured in the memory of surrounding highland societies. Further inland, the cultural legacy of Axum flourished. The Christian faith, introduced in the 4th century and strengthened through centuries of liturgical development, had become inseparable from the identity of the highland peoples. Monasteries founded during this transitional period played a vital role in preserving the intellectual and spiritual heritage of the ancient kingdom. These monastic centers copied manuscripts, preserved biblical translations, and maintained liturgical music that traced its origins to early Axumite Christianity. The period also witnessed the development of oral and written traditions that retrospectively shaped Axum's historical memory. Although the classical inscriptions and monumental records of earlier kings had become rare, later chroniclers crafted genealogies and narratives that connected contemporary rulers with the ancient Solomonid and Axumite lineages. These traditions, blending mythology and history, reinforced the idea that the Christian kingdom of the Highlands was the rightful heir of Axum's divine mandate. As the Highland polities matured, new regional powers began to emerge, drawing from Axumite culture, but developing their own administrative and architectural styles. Among the most important of these emerging powers was the kingdom that would eventually give rise to the Zagwe dynasty. Although the exact circumstances of the Zagwe rise remain debated, archaeological and textual evidence suggests a gradual consolidation of authority in the Lasta region, supported by strong monastic alliances and a shared Christian identity inherited from the Axumite tradition. During this time, Axum's territorial reach contracted significantly. Coastal regions aligned increasingly with Islamic polities, whose maritime networks connected them to Arabia, Persia, and the Indian Ocean world. The highland Christian kingdom, lacking a fleet and focused on inland stability, no longer attempted to reassert control over Red Sea trade routes. Instead, it embraced a defensive posture shaped by geography, mountain fortresses, controlled passes, and alliances with local nobles. Despite these limitations, cultural production did not stagnate. Early medieval churches in the highlands show continuity with Axumite architectural techniques, stone foundations, recessed windows, and monolithic pillars, while also incorporating new elements that would later define Ethiopian ecclesiastical design. Artistic traditions evolved as well. Iconography, manuscript illumination, and wood carvings drew inspiration from earlier Aksumite forms, but adapted them to new theological and aesthetic contexts. Perhaps the most important legacy of this period was the preservation of Ge'ez as a liturgical and literary language. Even as the political power of Axum waned, Ge'ez remained the medium for scripture, hymns, theological commentaries, and historical chronicles. Its continued use ensured that Axum's intellectual heritage would not be lost, but instead transmitted to subsequent generations. This continuity of language, the survival of a written script, tied to an ancient empire, is one of the most striking examples of cultural endurance in world history. By the 9th century, the memory of Axum lingered more as a symbol of sacred legitimacy than as a functioning political entity. Yet that memory carried extraordinary weight. The idea of Axum, its Christian identity, its ancient kings, its monumental past, became the ideological foundation on which Ethiopia. By the end of the 9th century, the political power of Axum had largely dissolved, but its memory had grown stronger than ever. In the absence of an active imperial court, Axum's legacy evolved into a foundational myth that would shape the identities of future Ethiopian kingdoms. The empire that once commanded the Red Sea had receded into the highlands, yet it remained alive in chronicles, liturgies, architectural traditions, and the imagination of successive generations. This enduring presence demonstrates that Axum's influence did not end with its political decline. It transformed into a cultural and spiritual inheritance that redefined authority in the Horn of Africa. Axum's legacy found perhaps its most powerful expression in the development of Ethiopian sacred kingship. Later chronicles, especially the medieval Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, wove Axumite history into a broader biblical narrative. According to these traditions, the rulers of Ethiopia descended from the union of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda. Their son, Menelik I, was said to have carried the Ark of the Covenant to Axum, establishing a sacred lineage that linked the Axumite kings to divine authority. Although the Kebra Nagast was composed centuries after classical Axum's decline, its impact was immense. It provided an ideological framework through which later dynasties, most notably the Solomonic dynasty that re-emerged in the 13th century, claimed legitimacy. The mythic genealogy connected contemporary rulers to both Axum and the biblical world, enhancing the prestige of Ethiopian kingship and giving spiritual depth to political authority. In this way, Axum's memory became inseparable from Ethiopia's identity. Religious continuity reinforced this legacy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved rituals, melodies, and liturgical traditions that traced their origins to the Aksumite period. Monasteries became centers of learning, copying manuscripts and preserving theological works. The survival of Ge'ez as a liturgical language ensured that ancient scriptures and hymns remained accessible to clergy and scholars. Even as Amharic and Tigrinya became spoken languages in daily life, Ge'ez remained a symbol of continuity, an unbroken chain connecting Christian Ethiopia to its Aksumite beginnings. Material culture also reflected this endurance. Churches built during the early medieval period employed architectural elements inherited from Axum: stepped platforms, square pillars, carved window frames, and the characteristic alternation of stone and wood layers. Even when the scale of construction diminished, the symbolic vocabulary remained rooted in Axumite forms. Later Ethiopian churches, carved directly into rock at places like Lalibela, demonstrate continuity with and transformation of Aksumite architectural principles, adapted to new contexts under the Zagwe dynasty. The sacred landscape of Axum itself remained a site of pilgrimage and reverence. Though no longer a political capital, it continued to host major churches, such as Mariam Tion, St. Mary of Zion, which Ethiopian tradition holds as the repository of the Ark of the Covenant. This association further elevated Axum's status in Christian imagination. Pilgrims traveled to the ancient city to partake in ceremonies and seek blessings, ensuring that Axum remained central to Ethiopia's spiritual life even as political power shifted elsewhere. Externally, Axum's memory persisted in the writings of Arab geographers, Byzantine chroniclers, and Persian historians who referred to the Christian kingdom of the highlands as a continuation of the ancient empire. Writers such as Alya, Kubi, and Almas Udi described Ethiopia's kings as powerful Christian rulers descended from the Aksumites. This external recognition helped preserve the idea of Ethiopia as a distinct civilization rooted in antiquity. As Ethiopia moved toward the medieval era, Axum functioned less as a living empire and more as a point of reference, a template for legitimacy, a symbol of divine favor, and a cultural anchor in times of change. The ideals of Aksumite kingship, the continuity of Christian worship, and the endurance of Ge'ez literature formed the intellectual foundation of later Ethiopian civilization. Although Axum had withdrawn from the political stage, it had not vanished from history. It lived on in stone, scripture, and story. Its symbols, crosses, monoliths, ancient inscriptions, continued to define the Ethiopian imagination. And its memory provided the spiritual and cultural cohesion that future dynasties would rely upon as they constructed new political structures atop the bedrock laid by their Aksumite ancestors. With the legacy securely embedded in the culture, Ethiopia stood on the threshold of a new era, one in which the traditions of Axum would re-emerge in transformed, yet recognizable forms under the Zagwe rulers. By the 10th century, the ancient empire of Axum had transitioned fully into a new political and cultural reality. The monumental urban center, once the hub of international trade and imperial authority, now existed as a sacred landscape, an enduring anchor of memory rather than a functioning capital. Yet the civilization that emerged from Axum's transformation did not represent a break with the past. Instead, it formed a continuous thread, reshaping, adapting, and reinterpreting Aksumite traditions to forge the medieval Christian kingdom that would dominate Ethiopian history for nearly a millennium. The Zagwe dynasty, which rose to prominence in the Lasta highlands, embodied this transformation. While not universally recognized as direct descendants of the Aksumite royal line, the Zagwe rulers styled themselves as inheritors of Axum's mantle. They adopted Christian symbols, upheld Ge'ez as the language of liturgy, and reinforced the authority of monasteries, elements deeply rooted in Aksumite identity. Their political strategy drew on the model established by Axum's sacred kingship, the ruler as both temporal leader and protector of the Christian faith. The Zagwe kings were major patrons of religious architecture. Their most iconic achievement, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, stands as one of the most remarkable architectural creations in world history. Entire monolithic structures carved from living stone reflect a direct inheritance from Aksumite engineering traditions. While the style differs from the classical stelae and palatial foundations of Axum, the conceptual ambition, the desire to create sacred space through monumental craft, remains the same. The symbolic alignment of the Lalibela complex, intended to mirror the holy city of Jerusalem, underscores the continuing role of Christian ideology as a defining force in Ethiopian statecraft. Administratively, the Zagwe period marked a shift from the expansive imperial model of Axum to a more regionalized yet centralized system of governance. The kings relied on alliances with monastic leaders, fostering a religious environment in which spiritual legitimacy reinforced political authority. Land grants to churches and monasteries expanded ecclesiastical influence, creating a network of religious communities that served as repositories of learning, law, and cultural memory. This ecclesiastical infrastructure preserved and expanded the manuscript traditions inherited from Axum, illuminating the scriptures, copying hymnals, and developing theological commentary that enriched Ethiopian Christianity. The Solomonic dynasty, which supplanted the Zagwe rulers in the 13th century, drew even more directly on Aksum's symbolic power. By claiming descent from the ancient line of Menelik I, the Solomonic kings positioned themselves as the true heirs of the Aksumite Empire. They revived the ideology of sacred kingship, produced new chronicles detailing genealogical links to Aksumite rulers, and presented their reign as the restoration of a royal lineage interrupted but never extinguished. This ideological framework, built upon the legacy of Aksum and reinforced by the Kibra Nagast, shaped Ethiopian political culture for centuries. Even as political structures evolved, material and cultural practices continued to echo Aksumite origins. Church construction retained features from the ancient tradition, decorative friezes, stepped platforms, and symbolic window patterns. Manuscript illumination incorporated motifs traceable to early Aksumite Christian art. Rural communities maintained agricultural practices descended from ancient terracing and irrigation systems. The Ge'ez language, though no longer spoken in daily life, endured as the medium for scripture, law, and literature, binding the medieval kingdom to its Aksumite past. Externally, Ethiopia's reputation as the heir to Axum remained strong. Arab, Persian, and later European writers continued to refer to Ethiopian rulers as the kings of Habasha, and often linked them to the ancient Christian kingdom that had once dominated the Red Sea. The legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian emperor imagined by medieval Europeans, was partially inspired by reports of Ethiopia's Christian resilience, itself rooted in Aksum's early conversion. What makes the story of Axum extraordinary is not simply its rise or fall, but its ability to reinvent itself. As an empire, Axum commanded trade routes, built colossal monuments, minted gold coins, and shaped international politics. As a cultural legacy, it preserved a script, a religion, an architectural tradition, and a sense of sacred kingship that endured long after imperial structures dissolved. The transformation from Axum to medieval Ethiopia demonstrates the remarkable capacity of a civilization to adapt, to relinquish the burdens of empire while preserving the core elements of identity. In its twilight, Axum became something greater than a political power. It,